First Sergeant Kep here with Company D, 2nd United States Sharpshooters, and thanks for joining me in the workshop today. I have a hardtack box that I need to make, and I wanted to take some time to show you how you can make your own. So if you want the period correct instructions, there's a couple places you can go. You can check period manuals that have very clear instructions on what the government was expecting for these hardtack boxes, or you can refer to A.J. Hamler's Civil War Woodworking Volume 1. Some of the biggest differences with period correct construction versus what I'm going to demonstrate today is wood thickness. And I've brought this up in other videos. 3/4 inch pine especially is overrepresented in the hobby, but it is really kind of what most people have access to unless you have the budget to just buy it professionally made to the correct dimensions. The original boxes would have had thicker ends, about 1 inch. And if you don't have a lumberyard or hardwood dealer that sells, say, 8, 10 quarter wood or 4/4 wood, then you can just turn to a 2x12 and thickness that down to a solid 1 inch, either on a bandsaw or on a power planer or old school with a scrub plane. Now, not everyone has that ability or those tools on hand. So you can use just straight 3/4 inch pine for the entire box, and that's what I'm going to demonstrate today. The rest of the boards, instead of being 3/4, would have been 5/8 inch thick. Again, you would need tools or woodworking knowledge to thickness all of this wood to the proper dimensions. Now, the reason I don't want you to sweat having the wrong thickness of wood is because when the lid's closed, no one's gonna really know what the actual dimensions of the boards are. The only thing they'll be able to see is the lid itself, and if the box is sitting on the grass, maybe they'll see some of the bottom of the box. But for, I'd say, 98% of people, they're not gonna know the actual dimensions. So this is a good project to get away with. The other great thing about a hardtack box is that it's just a board box held together with glue and nails. And like so much of this stuff, it was garbage. So if you're not very confident about your woodworking skills or you don't have a whole lot of experience, this is a very forgiving project. I really encourage everyone to try to make their own. It's not that hard to do. Now, if you're a campaigner, there's no reason for you to have a hardtack box when you're marching on the trail. Now, one of the realities of Civil War woodworking is that by making period correct style boxes, it allows us to accommodate say loaner gear, for example, that we may be responsible for. And many of us reenact with our families, and families sometimes require more stuff, especially if you reenact with your kids or your loved ones. So there's a lot of reasons to have a hardtack box. They're really only technically appropriate in a long-term camp style scenario. And I also want to keep in mind that what I'm going to show you is just what the instructions show. I want you to kind of see the hardtack box and stuff like ammo boxes as sort of a blank canvas. Soldiers repurposed these items constantly throughout the war, making all sorts of different types of camp furniture, from stools to bars to miniature libraries and officer desks. I made an officer desk for Captain Whitehall out of a hardtack box. I've made trunks out of hardtack boxes. So really kind of use your imagination. However you adapt it, try to use period construction methods and hardware. And so I think we're ready to get started. First thing I did was I cut all the wood to length. Now for this project, I used 2 1x12 by 10 foot pine boards I got at the box store. Be very selective about the wood you choose. If you are set up and have the capability for a lot of milling, then you can buy cheaper, junkier boards because you can resurface them and join them in your shop. Now, if you have limited tools and limited experience, you're going to really want to pick through the pile of boards and get the straightest boards that you can, as well as the clearest boards that you can. This one, you can see the grain is running vertically, and that means this board is going to be more stable. If you get more knots in a board, or if you get the cathedral grain, then the boards are going to be less stable. So that means once it's assembled and it's exposed to varying levels of humidity, those boards are going to react to the environment. Some people are really surprised to see their boxes looking absolutely perfect when I hand them to them, but once they're out in the rain or a really dewy morning, the lid's cupped. And I just have to explain to them that that is how actual solid wood works. And it's a really important educational experience because we're used to living in climate-controlled environments, and a lot of our furniture is made from man-made materials, plywoods, MDF, stuff that is a lot more stable in multiple humidity levels in multiple environments. So solid wood is going to have a life of its own, and so you need to think about that as you're choosing your material. Now, if you have limited skill and knowledge in woodworking or limited milling ability, then you may even want to consider buying what they call select pine. Now, I was at the box store earlier today buying this wood, and 1 by 12 by 8 foot was going for $40. The select pine is generally much, it's very clear with very few knots. They dry it more carefully, and it's milled much more carefully, and that's what you're paying for. But those boards are pretty much project ready without having to do anything to them. The common boards that I bought from the box store were only $21, so that kind of gives you a price difference. Based on your ability and the time you have to dedicate to this project, you can kind of wiggle that budget around a little bit. So the dimensions that we're going to start out with, the long sides of the box are 26 inches and the ends are 15 3/4. So you're going to need 2 sides, the front and the back, at 26. And then you're going to need 4 more for the lid and the base of the box. Both of those are going to be 26 inches. Now, the long sides of the box, you can cut immediately at dead on 26 inches. For the lid in the bottom, I cut them a little bit long. So anywhere from an extra 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch is fine. And then when I rip them to width, I'll rip them a little fat. And that is to accommodate any sort of wood movement that might occur during glue up. If you're fully confident or you have just enough wood to finish the project, you can cut it dead on and hope for the best. But not every board is going to be the same, since we're not going to go into a whole lot of like mill work and specialty joining for this project. So it's always nice for the lid and the bottom, leave a little bit oversized, and you can fit it exactly once everything is assembled. So now we have everything cut. Most boards may have either a damaged edge or a slight round over. And the first thing I like to do is rip any roundovers off so I have nice crisp edges. For doing nice projects, I have a Freud glue line rip blade in my table saw. These glue line rip blades, while not necessary, are fantastic, especially when you're doing a lot of glue ups or you don't have the time or the tools to do any hand plane work and joining work. These glue line rip blades, while they're more expensive than most blades, are a really good investment if you're going to be making a lot of these. So I'm going to get some eye protection, ear protection, and start ripping these edges off. And now to cut all 4 sides of the box to the final dimensions of 9 3/4 inches. Now, when we start to cut to final dimensions on all 4 sides, now is your chance to pay attention and cut off any knots that might be in the way that you can get rid of now as we make these the right size. So, eyes, ears, dust. Now we have all 4 sides of our hardtack box cut to width. It's now time to glue up the boards that will be our lid and our bottom of the box. Now, the first thing you gotta do is make sure that you line up your boards, make sure there's no gaps. And you can see if you get in close, just how tight of a glue joint you have just with that glue line rip blade. I haven't put a plane to this at all, so this is ready to go. Now to hold the boards together, we are going to cut a tongue and groove joint in it. And to do that, I'm going to use a Lie-Nielsen tongue and groove plane. Now you can also cut this out on the table saw if that's what you prefer, but I really like hand tools and traditional woodworking, and I just find that a tongue and groove plane is a lot faster and a lot quieter. Now, in order for the tongue and groove plane to work, you have to reference the same sides of the board. So if this is how we want our board to go together, we need to mark our faces, and then we just pick one to start with. So now I'm gonna lock this up in the vise, and this is the tongue and groove plane. It has a fence that'll switch around. So you can cut a groove with one fence setting, or you can adjust the fence and cut the tongue with the other fence setting. Now, the reason why these are so incredibly accurate is because you're referencing the same side of the board on each board. Now, it doesn't matter if this is exactly 3/4 of an inch, as long as the reference point is the same, because then the tongue and the groove will line up perfectly. And that tongue and groove joint, in addition with glue, is going to give us a really nice, strong, stable top and bottom to our box. Now, all I did was cut off the round edge on the top and bottom boards. And then once the glue is all dried up, I'll take them out and then I'll cut them to their final overall width and length. So let me show you how this handy tool works. So I put it firmly against the board, I hold it and I start on one end, and I push and I work my way back. Might help if I get the fence locked in. There we go. And then you just keep working your way back, and as you work your way back, you're giving your plane a path to follow. And if you're new to hand planes, you want to be really careful that you don't have to use a ton of strength. You just let the iron do the cutting for you. And you can see I'm just pushing, and when I get to this end, I let off and I push with the back. And then you just keep going until this bottoms out. It has a built-in depth stop, and once it stops cutting, the tongue is cut. So I'm going to show you one other way you can do this that's not a power tool. So the other way you can cut a tongue and groove is with a plow plane, and it has changeable irons that you can put into it, and you line up your fence a similar way, same reference points, And this will cut your groove. And then to cut your shoulders for your tongue, you would use a rabbet plane like this Stanley 78. Again, it has a depth stop so you can lay everything out, and these also have a fence. So there's a lot of different ways you can go about creating this glue joint. So I'm gonna finish this one and I'll show you how to do the other side. So now we have our tongue cut, and you can see that when I put the plane back on it, a depth stop is engaged and it is no longer cutting. So we have reached our maximum size for our tongue. So now we need to cut the groove, and carefully picking up the board, paying attention to our face side. I'm gonna put it in so that this face side will reference the fence on the tongue and groove plane. Now I will take the plane, I will flip the fence around, and then the same technique as before, starting on one end, and just take my time. And this is going to cut a groove. And as you work your way back, you give your plane a groove to follow in. And just like that, we're all the way through the complete end of the board. And now it's just a matter of reaching our final depth. So now I got everything laid out. I got protection for my glue squeeze out. And now we're going to glue our joints together. So I'm just using Titebond 2. I like the way Titebond 2 glues up a joint. 3 will be perfectly fine. I just think that the 3 is a little bit runny for what I want to use it for. There we go. And I always get these little flux brushes, and that way I can make sure my glue is evenly distributed in the groove. You don't have to get down to the very ends because you're gonna have squeeze out. And squeeze out is absolutely important. So you want nice even squeeze out to know you actually glued everything together right. So now here, I'm just gonna try to get the corners. Just run a bead. Go. And then spread everything out. You don't have to be bashful about using glue. You don't need a whole lot, but use as much as you feel is necessary. Because if you use too much, it's just going to come out. So, you know, worst case scenario, you use too much glue and you just have to clean up some more. So I'm actually, on this example, I'm deliberately adding too much glue because I want to demonstrate to you what even squeeze out looks like. So I need to kind of overdo it in order to demonstrate. So now, I'll line up my boards. Take your time on this part. And squeeze. Now my personal preference is to start on the ends, and then I'll put some clamps in the middle. The biggest mistake people make is putting too much clamping pressure on their glue ups. And one, you can potentially starve your joint of glue. I mean, you can actually squeeze all the glue out of the joint. But what's actually most likely going to happen is you're going to make your glue up bow. So I super tightened this one so you can see how much flex you get out of a board if you over tighten. So right here, you can see we have good pressure. We have a nice even glue bead all the way along. We'll clean that up. Okay. So now I got to reach over here. Get this one tighten a little bit more. Okay. Again, even glue bead all the way down. Now, let me get some more paper towels. Now, alternate your clamp locations. So you have some on top and some on the bottom. And then push down. The biggest thing you want after having even pressure, even glue squeeze out, is you want to make sure that your boards dry flat, because if it dries cupped, you have a whole lot of work in your future. Now we're ready to start assembling the box. And before I do that, I like to lay out my nail locations because I think even nail spacing leaves a nice professional appearance. And to assemble it, I'm going to use mostly these 2-inch box nails and a little bit of glue. But since we'll be putting glue on the end grain of the side pieces, the glue isn't going to do a whole lot, but it's a little bit belts and braces. So to lay out my nail locations, I'll take a pair of compasses. I will set the compasses to 3/8 of an inch, and I will run a line from the edge of each board. And then my first nails on the top and the bottom will be in 3/4 of an inch on each end, and I'll mark that. Then, since I don't like doing any more math than I have to, instead of doing the fractional math in my head, I'll just take my pair of dividers and then I will pace off. So I have 4 equally spaced nail locations. And then once that's done, I'm going to drill these with my egg beater drill to help the box nails set in a little bit better and help reduce my risk of splitting the edges of the board. Now, making sure that you have all your face sides and face edges facing the right way, we're ready to start nailing. Now, you can always put a little bit of glue on your end piece and rub it in. You mostly want to smush it into the end. Like I said, it's not going to do a whole lot, but it'll help a little bit. Then you line everything up and do yourself a favor before you get too committed. Just go ahead and start your box nails. Now, if you haven't used these before, I get these from Tremont Nail Company, and you want the wedge going along the grain. You do not want the wedge going across the grain because it's a wedge. It's going to crack the wood down the grain. So once you use these a few times, you'll get the hang of it, and drilling the holes in advance helps a whole lot. Okay, now we're ready to start driving these home. Take your time, line everything up really well. This will save you a lot of time having to square the box. And I'll go halfway and work my way down, making sure everything stays flush. Then once everything's aligned and started, run them home. Now that we have the bottom, or I guess the main part of the box assembled, it's now time to figure out how wide to cut our bottom. Now, since every board's slightly different, we haven't milled or joined these boards. These are straight off the shelf from the box store. They could be a little out of square, they could be slightly different thicknesses. So instead of trying to go off a direct instruction, I want to cut this to fit. And to do that, I'll find the center of the ends. And then I'll mark it and I'll bring the line over the edge, and I'll do that on both sides. Because we have this joint line from our tongue and groove joint, I'm going to line that joint line up with my halfway mark on both sides. And then I'm just going to take my pencil and mark where I need to cut, and then square that line on both sides, and then I will rip this much off of each side. I don't know what that measurement is, it doesn't matter. I'm still going to rip the ends off just a little bit fat, so that way when I nail it on, I can flush fit it with a hand plane. Now that the bottom of your box is attached with glue and nails, it's time to address the lid. And I fit the lid in the exact same way that I fit the bottom. But there are some things you're gonna wanna consider doing to your lid to make it more usable. For example, I put some 3/4 by 1 inch long cleats on the lid to make sure it doesn't slide off. The originals wouldn't have had these because the lid would have just been discarded as soon as it was broken into. Now, I've seen plenty of hardtack boxes out there where they just glue some boards and call that the lid, but it overlooks a very important detail in that the lids were nailed down. And you could just nail it onto the box and then pry it all off, but that could damage your piece. If it doesn't matter, go right ahead. But the easier way that I do is I'll go ahead and I'll lay out all of my nail holes and I'll drill them. And then I'll go over and I'll hit it with the head of a box nail. So I'm going to show you how I do that. So I lay the lid on my workbench. I have a block of wood to support the piece. And then paying attention to the direction that the head would be going, I just eyeball that on top of the lid and give it a whack with the hammer. And then I'll go all the way around, putting those dents into the board for that nice little historical finish. Once you get that done, we're going to be ready to start stenciling. To do this stencil work, you're only going to need a few basic items. For paint, I use basic craft store acrylic paint, and I use flat bottom foam brushes. Now, you can get all the stencils that you need for this from AJ Hamler's Civil War Woodworking website, and they are in PDF form, and they are all in the proper size. So you can print them out at home or at a copy center. Now, if you plan on making multiple hardtack boxes or ammo boxes, anything that's going to require you to use a stencil multiple times, I would consider having a plastic stencil cut. The local print shops wanted to charge me hundreds and hundreds of dollars for this service, but I looked online and I finally found a place called Stencil Revolution, and they took the electronic files and cut these out for me and had them at my house in less than a week for, I think I got 2 or 3 stencils, I can't remember, for only $60. And with having them cut out on plastic, that means I can wash and reuse, and I never have to worry about recutting the stencil. Because some of those big ones can easily take 1 to 2 hours, and you only get 1 or 2 uses out of them. So that might be something for you to consider if you plan on making more of these. If not, then you can just print them out at home and use them once and move on. Now we have our stencil on our lid. And since I have a plastic stencil, and you can use this with a paper one, you figure out where you want your stencil to go, and you can be as precise about your location as you want to be. The people making these probably didn't give it a whole lot of thought. And I'll use just enough masking tape as necessary to keep my stencil from moving or flexing. And if you're using a paper stencil, you'll want to make sure that your paper is stretched nice and taut to prevent any bowing. And another tip is, if you're using a paper stencil, is you might want to grab a bunch of sewing needles, the sewing pins, so that if you have a difficult place like between letters, for example, then you can pin that down on the wood, and that'll help keep the paper stencil from puffing up and giving you a messy stencil. Then I just have wax paper or whatever you want to use to put your paint on. And if you have a big one, just add more paint as you need it so it doesn't dry on you. And then using your brush, just take a little bit at a time. You don't want to use too much paint because it'll bleed around the stencil or across the letters. And then you just daub the paint in as straight up and down pattern as possible. If you try to get too much angle on it, what'll happen is that paint will be forced underneath the stencil and give you a really messy result. And then with using just enough to get the job done, you can always add more paint if you need to, and it's always better to use just what you need and go back. And then you just keep going until you're done. Let it dry for a few minutes. The acrylic craft paint dries pretty quickly, but just give it a little bit of time to get solid enough that it won't stick to the paper, and then just carefully remove it and you'll have a nice looking stencil. Now we have our lid completed. Set this out of the way. Now my client wants handles on the box, and that's really handy. The originals, of course, do not have handles, but if you're going to be storing stuff in here, some rope handles really make it a lot easier to do. So I have some rope, and I have my brace and my bit, and I'm going to drill 2 holes on the end of the box to receive the rope handles. Now to find that size, you just measure the width of your hand and add a little bit more for comfort. And then you'll want to have, my preference is anyway, to have enough rope sticking up above the lid of the box so that your knuckles don't bang on the corners of the box, and it makes it for a lot more comfortable carry. Once you know how wide your holes need to be apart, you find the center of the ends, and then you mark your 2 entry holes the right distance apart. So for this, I like to use my bit and brace. This goes really quickly. And then you just want to go through until the tip of your drill bit hits the other side. Go and do the other one. You can just go right through or use say a Forstner bit or even a brad point bit if you're depending on the size of your rope. But when you're using augers, you'll get a whole lot of blowout on the opposite side if you go all the way through. So you want to drill till the tip comes out on the other side and then go in the other way, and you have good results every time. Congratulations on making it this far. We are in the home stretch and we only have one final detail to address for you to have your very own period correct style, easily made hardtack box. So we have to put sapling strapping around the edges of the hardtack box. These were wrapped fully around the box to help control the contents a little bit more. Since this is going to be loaded into cars and drug around a little bit, I am only going to strap the top sides of this box. You're welcome to wrap the entire box as it would have been. They just may not last for very long. So before we get into this next step any further, now is the time for you to decide if you want to put any sort of finish on your box. The original hardtack boxes, of course, did not have any finish on them. For this box, I have decided to use our lacquer for small arms, and we have a video on how to make this. I'll have a link down in the description. And then you'll need to go and take a walk. So when you're outside, you'll want to find a sapling, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch, 1/2 inch. We have big leaf maple that grows like a weed on our property. So I just went out with some pruning shears and chopped down a sapling. And you'll want to split the sapling down the middle. 1 6-foot or so sapling should be enough for both sides. And then you can use a pocket knife or something to split it down the middle. For me, I just ran it through the bandsaw. And when you run it through a bandsaw, you'll get some fuzzies. And I'll just take my spoke shave and quickly knocked off all the fuzzies. Then you'll want to lay out your sapling and find where it's going to bend around the box. Now, I don't think the carpenters who are originally making these put much time or effort into this, but if you're trying to make it look nice, you may want to consider finding your corners and cutting a notch, and also removing some of this material is going to help your sapling stretch a little bit. If getting the sapling is going to be difficult for you, you might actually want to cut 2. Since you're working with natural materials, there's really no telling what it's going to do or whether or not it wants to be part of this project. So give yourself some extra material to work with. To hold it together, I am just going to use some fine finish cut nails. And a little tip is you don't have to buy every length of nail in the catalog. What I'll do for this project is I'll just cut the nail shorter for my purposes. And these nails are super soft steel, which is so great because it allows the wood to expand and contract very easily. So once we have all of our corners figured out, then we'll line it up where we want it to go. And it helps just kind of eyeball it and then pre-drill through the sapling. And then you can take your nail and get it started. Now, the pre-drilling isn't necessary. It is definitely going to make a difference in preventing your sapling from splitting on you. One place, anywhere on the ends, is going to be your highest risk of splitting. So in some cases, especially if the sapling you have is particularly brash or brittle, or it's in the dead of winter, and it may not be as pliable as say early spring, you may want to consider drilling an even bigger hole to make sure that it doesn't split. But they didn't care then either. So once your sapling is completely nailed on in one piece, I'll just go back with a saw and cut this part off on both sides so that way the lid will be free. And once you have your strapping on, you have a complete hardtack box. I hope you've enjoyed this video on how to make a hardtack box. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know down below. And we look forward to making more projects with you. Thank you so much for watching, liking, and subscribing. We'll see you next time.